So we're going to actually roll into Antonio Brown now. He was also traded. I'm sure there's a lot to say there. It's a very different situation. He essentially forced the trade and forced his way out of Pittsburgh in the way that he acted, in the things that he did, the things that he said to the media. So it was definitely a different approach. I mean, Odell said he wanted to stay in New York for the rest of his career. So completely flipped. And, Antonio Brown's a little older. So they only got, the Steelers, that is, only got a third-round pick and a fifth-round pick for Antonio Brown.
Crazy.
Talk about egregious, to use
crazy.
Ryan's favorite word down there.
Yeah.
Kev, I'll let you start us off on the Antonio Brown talk here. I mean, I can't really blame the Steelers. He forced his way out, and the Steelers are really good at drafting receivers and getting rid of them a year too soon rather than a year too late. What are your thoughts on the situation?
I think the Steelers got taken to the woodshed on that deal, but they didn't really have an option because it was clear. People looked at what Antonio Brown was doing and acting like this is who he's been through his entire career. It really hasn't been.
Right.
He was very systematic in the way that he did it. He knew exactly what he was doing. Him and his agent had a plan. There were certain places he did not want to go to. I mean, he could be a Buffalo Bill right now, but he kiboshed that. I mean, and he was smart in the way that he did it. Now, going to the Raiders, a lot of people look at the Raiders and be like, oh, that's an awful landing spot. I actually don't mind the landing spot. I think, had he went to the Redskins, the Titans, the Bills probably would have been somewhere in that range, maybe lower. The Ravens, places like that, I would have hated it. But with this, I don't think the Ravens are awful. Right now, he is the only option. They did bring in Tyrell Williams, in free agency. So I think they're heading in a direction. Personally, I think they're moving it a little bit. We went from last year to a rebuild. They traded off Cooper. They traded off Khalil Mack. They got all these assets. And now it's I felt like they would have been better off waiting a couple more years, continuing to build assets and probably draft a franchise quarterback, because I don't think that's what Derek Carr is. I think Derek Carr, as a lot of people will laugh at, I still 100% believe he is Jared Goff. And people are going to be like, wait, what? Jared Goff is a good quarterback when you put all the pieces around him, that he can be an average to above average quarterback. And I think that's what Derek Carr is. We've seen it before when they had a lot more talent. Amari Cooper, when Michael Crabtree was younger, and they had all these talent, and he almost went to the MVP. He almost won an MVP, in 2016. I do think Derek Carr is a good enough landing spot. I don't think people are going to say Antonio Brown's a second or third round pick in fantasy football. I think that's laughable. He is still, in my opinion, still a top 5 option, and I will go to the grave fighting anybody that says that he's not. I don't mind.
At wide receiver or overall?
At wide receiver, I still think he's the top 5 option. I think that they're going to feed him the football. I think that he is still an elite level talent. He has not fallen. People talk about him like he fell off last year. He had 1,300 yards and 15 touchdowns. Still a boss. All right.
Yeah.
Juju Smith-Schuster there.
That's what happens when you're Antonio Brown and you set the expectations so high.
Yes. So I have no problem with the landing spot. I still think he's a top 5 wide receiver. And if I can get him in the second or third round, I'm going to be happy, because that is terrific value.
I actually think that your Derek Carr take was very, very logical and reasonable, which was a surprise coming from you. So that's awesome. No,
Savage.
I don't know, that big just popped out. I wasn't even trying to do that. No, I thought that was a very logical take. I think I'm very aligned with your thinking. It was just driving me crazy how much I was seeing on Twitter. So many people like, oh, I would never take this guy with a 10-foot pole. And I wanted to smack every one of them and be like, do you know that we're talking about Antonio Brown? It's my same feelings about Odell Beckham, but Odell Beckham is younger, which is obviously the big difference. But this is Antonio Brown, possibly the best wide receiver ever. Yes, Jerry Rice has the numbers, but my eyes have seen Antonio Brown play. This dude is a complete freak. It's obviously a downgrade, but I agree with you, Kev. I think we're very in sync. Like I said, that it's not that big of a downgrade. The targets will be there. The volume will be there. They're going to use him in an insane amount, and he's still incredibly talented and valuable. So I just had to clarify, because I thought you may have been going top 5 overall, which I wouldn't do anymore. But I still think that he would be in my top 5 wide receivers as well. I haven't really thought that through. But, I would prefer Devontae Adams, Michael Thomas, Odell Beckham, probably DeAndre Hopkins, because there is some uncertainty there. Like I said, it's definitely a downgrade, not that big of one, but it's still a downgrade. So we have to, but I think he falls into that 5-6 range. I think he's still going to be a beast.
Yeah, I mean, he's Antonio Brown. Everything that I've seen it's just hilarious to me. I mean, we're talking about two wide receivers here who can absolutely change the game when they're on the field. And one's treated differently than the other because one's been just more in the media recently than the other. I feel like people want to forgive Odell for all of his antics, like on the field and what he said, just because he got his big contract from New York last year. But Antonio Brown, like the prima donna notion of Antonio Brown just recently started coming out just because he didn't feel like he was getting treated that well from the organization. So he did what any, reasonable person would do. And he was out there like speaking his mind. And it's like the same thing that we see with the basketball players. It's like, shut up and play. Like that's what people wanted Antonio to do, let alone, forgetting that he restructured his contract last March so that the Steelers could have a positive number in cap space instead of negative to go out there and make some moves, which I think a lot of people were thinking that $9 million that they saved, they were going to use that money to somehow try and woo Le'Veon Bell back, another player that they've scorned in the past. So like the Steelers organization really has not done a justice for themselves of making their players feel welcome there. And Antonio Brown, instead of sticking it around in a bad situation, was like, get me the hell out. And he had the best agent to do that in Drew Rosenhaus. We've seen this play out with T.O. in the past. So like this dude, it just helps receivers all the way along. So while they didn't get enough back for him, I don't know how many teams would have wanted in Antonio Brown just because of how it has played up in the media, and people knew that they had leverage against the Steelers. They knew that they wanted to move him. They knew that the Rooneys weren't going to sign him back. So they were throwing out low ball offers, knowing that they're going to balk at one of these because
that's why 31 teams should have been making offers.
Right. Well, yeah. Exactly. But
no, thanks for getting me fired up because honestly, I don't even really care that much about the fantasy implications right now. You can hate me for that if you want, but these are such big moves that thank you for firing me up because imagine not being on team Antonio Brown. And I get it. He said some crazy things going on the show with LeBron, doing that NFL Network interview. He said some stuff that you can't come back from that was very, very scary if you're listening. But Kev, to your point, I do agree that having some hindsight bias with it, I wasn't really thinking it in the moment, but I think it was calculated because he wanted out. And imagine not being on his side of things when, first of all, people are trying to act like he didn't control the show, which obviously he did. And just the fact that look at Ben Roethlisberger. Elliot Chris put out the long list of just reports, and it's laughable. This dude obviously seems like a dick. And so when he's throwing Antonio Brown under the bus, yes, Antonio Brown has gotten all his numbers from Big Ben, and vice versa. Big Ben has benefited from playing with one of the best, if not the best, wide receivers ever. There needs to be some partnership there, and it just didn't seem like there was. And so I get it. He decided what he wanted out, and he made it happen. And just, yeah. And the other thing, too, is imagine not being on Team Juju. I'm not worried about Juju Smith-Schuster one bit. Outside, inside, it doesn't matter. This dude's a complete stud. Not worried about him at all.
Yeah, Antonio Brown's still he's still a top receiver. He's top 5 for fantasy, I believe. Derek Carr's going to be out there, slinging the rock around. Who are the running backs right now? The running backs are absolutely atrocious. We talked about this when we were doing the article, Anthony, that the Oakland backfield
Dwayne and Jalen.
Disgusting.
Yeah, Dwayne Washington and Jalen Richard's restricted.
Right, and we know John Gruden
they're definitely addressing they're definitely going to go through the draft and grab and get a running back, which is going to be pretty interesting because they have upgraded their offensive line a little bit. Their offensive line, isn't the worst in the league, and I do think it's somewhat interesting. So whatever rookie running back falls into that situation is going to be pretty interesting.
I guess the interesting point that comes from all of this from a fantasy perspective, because I kind of started getting into it and I saw how passionate you were, Kev, because we know Raiders are going to be bad. Ryan, you hit on it. They have no running game. So they're going to have to throw a ton. Antonio Brown is insane, so he's going to be great. The question would be where I said, I'd rather have Devontae just because I know Aaron Rodgers is throwing him the ball. I know the continuity there. I know that there's not really other weapons. Obviously, I think Antonio Brown's a much better player. And we saw some of that on Twitter. But from a fantasy perspective, I would take in Devontae Adams. I guess my question to you, Kev, is seeing how passionate you were. Are you still buying into the talent, even though now the situation's questionable, and seeing how he pairs with Derek Carr is questionable versus the continuity that we know is coming from a player like that? And you can throw in Michael Thomas as well, because I think those two guys are the two guys that over the last 2 years have really came into the discussion, as I think they rightfully should be in the same discussion with these talented guys, definitely from a fantasy perspective. And I even think from a real life perspective, but Antonio Brown's been on the pedestal, on the top of the pedestal for 6-7 years. And so who would you go with in fantasy?
Well, so for me, I think, yes, it's 100% Odell is in there. DeAndre Hopkins would be 2. Michael Thomas would be 3.
Julio, I didn't say anything about Julio.
So and then you get to for me, Antonio Brown's a lock, and people are going to say, "Wait, you haven't said Devontae Adams yet." And
okay, that's what I wanted to see. Yeah.
So for me, it really is it's Devontae Adams, Julio, and even Tyreek Hill is in that discussion as well. Tyreek Hill the last 2 years has dominated as well. He's never a guy that ever gets included in that discussion ever. But he certainly those
we
three.
We don't know what's going to play out with all that. So pending,
yes,
of course.
Except for here, we talk uphill every year. Just saying.
Yes. Well, no, 100% on that. But I have beat the drum on Tyreek Hill. But, we're not going to get into the Tyreek Hill situation. We all know what it is. But anyways, so for me, I know everybody loves Devontae Adams. Devontae Adams' numbers are just driven off his situation, right? If anybody steps up in that offense, if Geronimo Allison, who was having a nice year before he went down last year, if a guy I really like in St. Brown, who's an outside threat, there's a guy they drafted last year.
St. Brown.
I'm not saying that Devontae Adams isn't a top 10 option.
Who's the other dude? Who's the other rookie besides St. Brown?
Valdez Scantling or something like that.
Scantling showed out better than Equiniti.
And Jamon Moore, which is another guy they drafted, which they still could draft another wide receiver in this draft this year as well.
Are you trying to put those guys potentially in the same bucket as Devontae if they were to get the targets? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
His target, if all he has to do, he didn't have a ton of monster games last year. He was just consistent across the board, which is obviously what you're looking for.
Elite consistent though.
But, however, because I could also see them go more towards the run and not be as pass heavy if they're leading games and stuff like that. There's things that can change where I feel like that I am not as comfortable with him as other people are, as his big breakout year that he came off of, who's not a young. But so a lot of things could change. But as of right now, I think he's in the discussion with Julio Jones and Tyreek Hill with me, which is still fine company to be in. I'm not knocking the guy and saying that he's like a bum or don't even touch him. I don't feel as comfortable.
But I love you taking that stand. I love you taking that stand because screw consensus. Because I think I would tend to guess that my thought process is going to be consensus from a fantasy standpoint. Devontae, Aaron Rodgers, all this stuff. I love you taking a stand because it's still Antonio Brown. If somebody would have taken a stand, and I was in on Christian McCaffrey at the end of round 1, especially once we saw him being a stud. But somebody could have taken a stand and taken him first overall. And it would have been a great pick with what he did. So these are the type of situations, especially at the top of the draft board, where you take a stand on a player that you know is good and you're buying in a little bit more than other people, and that can win you a championship. That Christian McCaffrey helped me do that this year. So those are the situations where screw everybody. I'm still riding with the AB, and AB does AB things, and you could So what's
crazy is that the wide receiver pool, especially in the top 10, is nuts. It's astronomical. It's really good.
Right.
I mean, you could make an argument for almost any one of those guys, which
absolutely
is just crazy. I want to go back to Derek Carr for a second. I think the knock against him is his yard per attempt average, right? Pretty low comparatively to other quarterbacks in the NFL. But I mean, he didn't have Antonio Brown before. He had Amari Cooper, who he himself ran himself out of town because he didn't want to play for the Raiders anymore. So everybody keeps knocking on the Raiders like, why would you get rid of Cooper and then take in Brown? I mean, Cooper wasn't playing. He wasn't showing up. He was half running his routes. I mean, that's what I remember at least, and maybe I'm remembering incorrectly, but to me it felt like Cooper didn't want to be there anymore. He wanted to get traded. He got his wish. So I don't think the Raiders had much of a choice there. I mean, maybe he just didn't want to play with Derek. I don't know.
Well, and another,
it's debatable on how great Cooper is at this point. I mean, Amari Cooper is a solid wide receiver too, in my opinion. He's never going to be an alpha. That's not what he is, in my opinion. I just don't think that's who he is. I think he is a fine wide receiver too, upper echelon wide receiver too. But I don't think he's ever going to be
real life or fantasy.
And either one.
Because I think he's a wide receiver 1 in real life. But I was going to say, to Antonio Brown's point, we even saw Amari Cooper have a lot of good games in Oakland, but obviously it was extremely inconsistent. Well, what has Antonio Brown never struggled with over the last 6-7 years, as soon as he's entered this league as a starter and as a stud, is consistency. So maybe he falls into that bucket as Amari Cooper a little bit, because we even in Dallas we saw Amari Cooper be inconsistent. But how are you not going to be on a team that runs so much? But at the end of the day, maybe we see him fall into that bucket, but maybe we don't, because it's Antonio Brown and they're different players, and he's not as inconsistent, and he hasn't been. And if he doesn't, and he still puts up those big games like we saw Amari Cooper do, because Cooper's still putting up 40 DraftKings points and all this stuff in Oakland before he gets traded. It just was few and far between. So you're telling me Antonio Brown can't do that while having a floor of 12 to 15 PPR points every game? No, he absolutely can. So I'm not worried about it at all.
I'm not here to argue for Derek Carr. I mean, I think he's an average quarterback maybe, but last year we saw him push the ball down the field. He had his best yard per average of his career. He threw for 4,000 yards for the first time. He just didn't get it in the end zone. And I mean, he was throwing to Jared Cook. Jalen Richard had 81 catches, by the way. BT Dubs. So who was he throwing to?
Right. He had nobody. He was throwing to Seth Roberts. He was throwing to Marcel Aitman.
Jordy Nelson,
and I think in general, Jordy, who's basically done, pour one out. Sign with the Packers, please. But I think in general, the Baker Mayfields and the Pat Mahomes and the Aaron Rodgers are by far the exception to the rule, which is why we love this game, because they're so good. If you're lucky enough to have one of those quarterbacks on your franchise, enjoy it, Kev. But the main reason is that most of these teams are trying to build solid teams. That's why Dave Gettleman pisses me off. And you have a quarterback that, if the pieces fall a line around you the right way, now maybe you have a chance to win a Super Bowl. I think that's what we saw just happen with the Rams and Jared Goff. So that's why I'm agreeing with Kev's point, to the point, I think, Anthony, you just brought it up and got me on another tangent, so congratulations. That if the Raiders put all the pieces around Derek Carr, we've seen it earlier in his career. So most teams are dealing with that. Matt Stafford, if the Lions would ever put a good team around Stafford, I firmly believe he could win a Super Bowl if there's a team around him. There's a lot of quarterbacks that fall into that bucket, and not just the Mahomes dominations of the world.
Not every quarterback that wins a Super Bowl is carrying the
Look at Joe Flacco. He won a Super Bowl because he had a great team around him. And granted, he balled out in those playoffs, but overall, he's a very average quarterback. Eli Manning, you can make the same thing. If you put a team around these guys, you have a chance.
The odds of finding
even Peyton Manning, my Broncos. Peyton Manning wasn't shit in 2015. I love you, Peyton. Sorry, but he wasn't. And
but you're right. The odds of finding a legendary quarterback are very, very slim. So take an average guy, build a team around him. You can still win the big game. We've seen it countless times.